The afternoon sun was blazing outside, but inside the bank, the air was kept at a crisp, cool temperature that usually felt refreshing. Today, however, it just felt sharp. It was a Tuesday, which meant the branch was moderately busy with people on their lunch breaks. The atmosphere was a mix of hushed whispers and the fast, rhythmic tapping of fingers on keyboards. It was a place of efficiency, of numbers moving from one screen to another, a place that had little patience for things that moved slowly. Near the back of the line stood an elderly woman named Mrs. Gable. She was small and slightly hunched over, clutching a worn, faded leather coin purse against her chest, as if it contained diamonds rather than just loose change and a few crumpled bills. She was dressed in her best coat, a light tweed that had seen better days but was brushed clean. She had walked 4 blocks to get here, a journey that used to take her 10 minutes, but now took nearly 20. Her knees ached a dull, rhythmic throb, but she tried to ignore it. She had a mission to accomplish. Mrs. Gable watched the digital numbers above the teller stations change with a sense of dread. The technology in this place had changed so much since she first opened her account 40 years ago. Back then, the tellers knew her name. They asked about her grandchildren. Now, the glass partitions felt high and imposing, and the people behind them often looked straight through her, as if she were a ghost. Number 402, a crisp voice called out over the speaker system. Mrs. Gable looked down at the small slip of paper in her hand. For 15, she had a long way to go. She shuffled her feet, her sensible black shoes making a soft scuffing sound on the polished marble floor. She looked around at the other people waiting. There was a young man in a suit checking his phone every 5 seconds, his foot tapping with impatience. There was a mother trying to quiet a toddler in a stroller. Everyone seemed to be in a hurry, moving to a beat that Mrs. Gable couldn't quite hear anymore. She fell out of place, like a vinyl record in a streaming world. She shifted her weight and loosened her grip on her coin purse just enough to peek inside. It was full of quarters, dimes, and a handful of dollar bills she had saved from her grocery budget. It wasn't a fortune, but it was her contribution to the birthday gift for her great-grandson. She wanted to put it into his savings account, something she did every month. It gave her a sense of purpose, a way to show love even though she lived far away. Finally, the numbers ticked up for 10, 412, 415. "That's me," Mrs. Gable whispered, mostly to herself. She stepped forward, her heart beating a little faster. She hated these interactions. She always worried she would forget her PIN or hold up the line. She walked toward the empty counter, where a young man with slick back hair and a tie that looked a little too loose sat waiting. His name tag identified him as Brian. He didn't look up as she approached. He kept typing something on his keyboard, his eyes fixed on the screen. Mrs. Gable reached the counter and placed her coin purse down gently. She leaned in, speaking a bit louder than she intended in her nervousness. "Hello, young man." Brian stopped typing and looked up. He offered a polite, practiced smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Good afternoon, ma'am. How can I help you today?" "I would like to make a deposit, please," Mrs. Gable said, her voice trembling slightly. She fumbled with the clasp of her purse. It was stiff, and her fingers weren't as nimble as they used to be. The arthritis in her hands made small tasks feel like mountain climbs. She could feel Brian watching her, waiting. "Account number?" he asked, his finger hovering over the enter key. "It's—" Mrs. Gable paused, trying to recall the sequence of digits she had memorized. She pulled out a small index card from her pocket where she had written it down, just in case. She held it up to the glass. "It's right here." Brian squinted, then typed it in. "Okay, and how much are we depositing today?" "I have it right here," Mrs. Gable said. She finally managed to undo the clasp. She opened the purse and began to slide the coins and bills out onto the counter. It took her a moment to stack them neatly. She wanted to be organized. She wanted to show him that she was capable. $40 in cash, and, let me count the change, $2.50. Brian looked at the pile of loose change on the counter. He let out a very small sigh, a sharp exhale of air through his nose that Mrs. Gable caught. He reached under the counter and pulled out a plastic coin tube and a sorting tray. He slid them toward her, but he did it a little too hard. The plastic tray hit the glass with a dull thud. "You'll need to put the coins in the rolls, ma'am," he said, his voice losing a bit of that polite polish. "We don't accept loose change like this unless it's rolled. Or, if you want to use the coin machine in the lobby, there's a fee." Mrs. Gable stared at the plastic rolls. She hadn't rolled the coins. She didn't have any rolls at home. The thought of asking for them, or worse, having to use a machine which she found confusing and loud, made her stomach drop. "Oh," she said, her face falling. I didn't know. I'm sorry. The teller last time, she took them from me." "Well, policy changes," Brian said, leaning back in his chair. He crossed his arms. "I can give you some rolls, but you'll have to count them out yourself." "Here?" Mrs. Gable asked, looking at the long line of people forming behind her. She could feel their eyes on her back. She felt the heat rising in her cheeks. "Yes, here," Brian said. "Or you can take it with you and come back." Mrs. Gable looked at her watch. If she went all the way back home and came again, she would miss her bus, and it would be dark by the time she returned. She didn't want to walk that far again in the evening. "No, I'll do it now," she said, her voice quiet. "I'm sorry to hold everyone up." She began to pick up the quarters, her fingers shaking. It was slow work, picking up one coin, dropping it into the cardboard tube, pick up another, drop it in. The sound of the coins clinking seemed deafening in the silence between her and the teller. Behind her, she heard a man clear his throat loudly. She didn't dare turn around. She stared intently at the quarters, willing her hands to move faster, but they just wouldn't cooperate. She felt small. She felt useless. She just wanted to do something nice for her great-grandson, and now she was causing a scene. She could sense Brian's impatience radiating off him like heat from a radiator. He started tapping his pen on the counter. Tap, tap, tap. It was a sound that drilled into her anxiety. "Is everything okay up there?" A woman's voice called out from the back office. It was the branch manager, peeking her head around the corner. Brian turned his head slightly. "Just waiting for a customer to roll her change," he said, loud enough for Mrs. Gable to hear clearly. He didn't look at her as he spoke. He spoke about her, as if she were a nuisance rather than a person. Mrs. Gable fumbled a quarter. It rolled off the counter and hit the floor with a ringing sound that seemed to echo through the entire bank. She froze. She didn't know if she could bend down to get it, and she didn't want to make them wait any longer. She stared at the coin on the floor, feeling a hot tear prick the corner of her eye. She wiped it away quickly with the back of her hand, hoping no one saw. It's right there," she whispered, pointing a shaking finger at the floor. The shame washed over her, heavy and suffocating. This was supposed to be a simple errand, a way to feel useful, but now it felt like a punishment. She was trapped between the unforgiving counter and the impatient line, with no way out. The quarter on the floor seemed to shine accusingly up at Mrs. Gable. It was a small thing, really just a piece of currency, but in that moment, it felt like a heavy stone she had dropped. She stood there for a second, her hands gripping the edge of the counter to steady herself. Her lower back gave a sharp twinge as she debated whether to leave it there or try to retrieve it. Brian, the teller, let out another sigh, this one longer and more dramatic than the first. He didn't move to help her. He didn't lean over or offer a kind word. He just stared at his computer screen, tapping his finger against the plastic surface of the counter partition. The sound was a relentless, nervous tick that seemed to match the thumping of Mrs. Gable's heart. Finally, Mrs. Gable decided she couldn't leave it. Every cent mattered for the gift. She took a deep breath, braced her hand on the cool marble ledge, and slowly lowered herself down. Her knees popped audibly, a sound that made her wince. She felt the eyes of the room on her. She knew the businessman behind her was watching, probably checking his watch again. She felt the heat of shame crawling up her neck like a rash. Her fingers brushed the floor, groping for the coin. She found it and closed her fist around it, pushing herself back up with a grunt of effort. When she finally stood upright again, she was slightly out of breath. She placed the quarter on the counter with the others, her hand trembling not from the cold, but from the sheer humiliation of the situation. "Sorry," she whispered again, her voice thin and reedy. "I'm sorry." Brian didn't even acknowledge the apology. He just looked past her, his eyes locking onto a colleague who was organizing brochures at a desk a few feet away. "Hey, Lisa," Brian called out, raising his voice just enough so it would carry over the quiet hum of the bank. Lisa looked up. She was a young woman with a high ponytail and a name tag that sat slightly crooked on her blazer. She walked over, holding a stack of papers. "What's up, Brian? You look like you're stuck." "I am," Brian said, gesturing vaguely at Mrs. Gable without actually looking at her. "I'm trying to help this customer deposit her savings, but she's doing it the hard way. We're about 10 minutes behind schedule now because someone prefers to roll coins manually." Lisa looked at the piles of change on the counter, then at Mrs. Gable's flushed face. A small, amused smirk tugged at the corner of Lisa's mouth. She didn't look sympathetic. She looked like she was in on a joke that Mrs. Gable didn't understand. "Really?" Lisa asked, her tone light and teasing. "In this economy? I didn't think people actually carried cash anymore, let alone pennies." Mrs. Gable felt a sting in her eyes. She wasn't deaf. She could hear every word. She wanted to tell them that this was for her great-grandson, that these coins represented weeks of saving, that she remembered a time when money was physical and real, not just numbers on a screen. But she couldn't find her voice. It felt trapped in her throat. Instead, she focused desperately on sliding the dimes into the paper roll. Her fingers felt clumsy and thick, like sausages. "It's like a history lesson," Brian continued, turning his body fully toward Lisa now, completely ignoring Mrs. Gable. "I think I need to go find an abacus or something. Maybe a ledger book from 1950. Lisa chuckled, covering her mouth with her hand. "Just be careful you don't run out of ink," she joked. The laughter wasn't loud, but to Mrs. Gable, it was deafening. It bounced off the glass walls and the polished floor. She felt small, shrinking inside her coat. She was a nuisance. She was a relic. She was wasting their precious time. The worst part was that they weren't even yelling at her. They were simply dismissing her existence, treating her as an inconvenience to be mocked rather than a human being to be helped. From a line behind her, the man in the gray suit let out a loud, sharp exhale. "Is there a problem here?" he called out, his voice edged with irritation. "Some of us have meetings to get to." "No problem, sir," Brian said, his voice instantly changing from mocking professional as he addressed the man. "Just a slight delay with a complex transaction. We'll be with you shortly." He turned back to Mrs. Gable, the polite mask slipping back into place, but his eyes were cold. "Ma'am, if you could please hurry it up, there are people waiting." "I'm trying," Mrs. Gable said, her voice cracking. She tried to shove the last dime into the paper roll, but her hand was shaking so badly that she missed. The dime spun on the counter and fell to the floor again. Brian closed his eyes for a long second, his jaw tightening. Lisa was still standing there, watching with a look of bored amusement. "You know what?" Brian said, his patience finally snapping. "Why don't you just take that home and come back when you're ready? This is holding up the line." Mrs. Gable stared at him. "But I'm almost done," she pleaded. "Just 2 more rolls." "We don't have time for almost done," Brian said. He reached out and slid the coin rolls back toward her, bumping them into her hand. "Next time, use a machine. Or get a grandkid to help you with the internet." Lisa laughed again, a sharp, barking sound. "Good advice, Brian. Technology is a wonderful thing." Mrs. Gable felt the tears finally spill over. They tracked hot paths down her wrinkled cheeks. She quickly reached into her pocket and pulled out a crumpled handkerchief, dabbing at her eyes. She felt utterly defeated. She just wanted to go home. She wanted to be in her quiet living room, away from these bright lights and cold eyes. She began to sweep the coins back into her purse, her movements frantic and messy. She didn't care about neatness anymore. She just wanted to escape. The quarters clattered against each other, the sound harsh and loud. She could hear the man behind her muttering something under his breath about incompetence. As she fumbled with the clasp of her purse, the manager walked out his office. He was a tall man with a bright tie. He looked at the line, then at Brian, then at Mrs. Gable. "Everything all right here?" the manager asked, though he didn't sound like he really cared to know the answer. "Just helping a customer who needed a little extra time with some change," Brian said smoothly. He looked at Lisa, and they exchanged a glance that said everything. Just another difficult old lady. The manager nodded. "Right. Well, try to keep the line moving, Brian. Efficiency is key. Will do, Brian said. He turned his back to Mrs. Gable and started typing furiously on his keyboard, pretending to be busy. Mrs. Gable finally got her purse closed. She stood there for a moment, clutching it to her chest. She felt like she should say something. She wanted to tell them that kindness didn't cost anything, that they should be ashamed of themselves. But the words died in her throat. She was just one old woman against a world that had decided it didn't have time for her. She turned around slowly to leave. As she did, she avoided looking at the line of people behind her. She kept her eyes on the floor, watching her own scuffed shoes move one step at a time. She felt the weight of their judgment pressing down on her shoulders. She wasn't a person anymore. She was an obstacle. She was a story they would tell later about the slow old lady at the bank who ruined their lunch break. Mrs. Gable took a shaky step toward the exit, her heart heavy in her chest. The air in the bank felt suffocating, despite the cooling system. She had never felt so alone in a crowded room. She just wanted to push through the sliding doors and breathe fresh air, to disappear into the city and forget this moment ever happened. She was nearly at the rope barrier that marked the exit lane when she felt a sudden shift in the atmosphere behind her, a movement that cut to the heavy hum of mockery and impatience that misses. Gable kept her head down, her eyes fixed on the patterned carpet as she shuffled toward the exit. Every step felt heavier than the last, as if the humiliation she had just endured was weighing down her shoes. The air in the bank felt stale and suffocating, despite the gentle hum of the air conditioning. She could hear Brian moving on to the next customer, his voice shifting back to that smooth, professional tone, acting as if nothing had happened. It made her stomach churn. He could be so charming to the man in the gray suit, but to her, she was nothing more than a nuisance. She gripped the strap of her purse tight, her knuckles white. She just wanted to push through the glass doors and feel the sun on her face. She wanted to get away from the sound of typing and the smell of polished marble. She felt incredibly small, like a child who had been scolded in front of the whole class, except there was no teacher here to tell the bullies to stop. The adults in charge were the bullies. At the back of the line, near the velvet ropes that section off the waiting area, a man stood quietly observing the scene unfold. He was dressed simply in a dark, zip-up jacket and a worn baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. He had been there for nearly 20 minutes, patiently waiting his turn. He held a few deposit slips in his hand, but he wasn't looking at them. His attention was entirely fixed on the counter, where Mrs. Gable had just been standing. He had heard everything. He had seen the way Brian rolled his eyes. He had heard the cruel jokes about history lessons and abacuses. He had watched Lisa laugh, covering her mouth as if that made a mockery any less sharp. Most of all, he had seen the look on Mrs. Gable's face, that utter, crushing defeat that broke his heart. The stranger shifted his weight from one foot to the other. He wasn't a man who sought out trouble. He usually kept himself, valuing his privacy and trying to live a normal life despite the fame that followed him everywhere. But there was something about this situation that he couldn't ignore. It wasn't just about bad customer service. It was about a lack of basic human decency. It was about a young person kicking someone when they were already down. He watched Mrs. Gable walking away, her shoulders slumped forward. He looked back at the counter. Brian was laughing at something the manager had said, the tension in the room having dissipated for everyone except the woman who was leaving. The other customers in line were checking their phones or looking at the ceiling, pretending they hadn't seen a thing. They were all just glad it wasn't them. The stranger felt familiar tightness in his chest. It was a feeling he got when he saw injustice, a refusal to accept that that's just how the world works. He knew that if he walked out that door right now and ignored what happened, he would regret it. He couldn't let Mrs. Gable walk out feeling like she didn't matter. He couldn't let Brian and Lisa think their behavior was acceptable. He took a deep breath and let it out slowly. The decision was made. He wasn't there as a movie star or a celebrity. He was there as a human being. He stepped out of the line. "Excuse me," a voice said from behind him. It was a businessman in the gray suit, annoyed that the line was moving. "Are you getting out or what?" The stranger didn't turn around. He didn't apologize. He just kept walking. His stride was purposeful now, the casual slouch gone. He moved with a quiet intensity that cut through the background noise of the bank. As he walked past the other customers, a few of them looked up. They recognized him immediately. Their eyes went wide, mouths opened slightly. It was Keanu Reeves, but he didn't stop to sign autographs or smile for cameras. He was a man on a mission. He bypassed the empty teller stations and walked straight toward the area where the staff were congregating. Brian was counting a stack of bills, looking self-satisfied. Lisa was leaning against the desk, still smirking. The manager had just retreated into his glass-walled office, safely out of the way. Mrs. Gable was almost at the exit when she heard footsteps approaching fast from behind her. She flinched, thinking it might be security coming to scold her further, or perhaps the manager telling her she wasn't allowed to come back. She instinctively pulled her purse closer, preparing for another blow. But the footsteps didn't stop at the security desk. They passed her and then stopped, placing themselves directly between her and the counter where Brian and Lisa were standing. Mrs. Gable stopped and turned slowly, confused. She saw a man's back. He was wearing a dark jacket and a ball cap. He was standing with his feet shoulder-width apart, his posture straight and strong. He was blocking her view of the tellers, creating a shield. "Is there a problem here?" The man's voice rang out. It wasn't loud, but it carried a deep, resonant authority that silenced the hum of the bank instantly. Brian looked up, startled. He saw a customer standing in the restricted area near the staff desks. "Sir, you need to stay in the line," Brian started, using his typical customer service voice. "I can help you when you get to front." Keanu didn't move. He stood his ground. He didn't look at the line. He didn't look at the manager's office. He looked straight at Brian, and then his gaze shifted to Lisa, who had straightened up, looking nervous. "I'm not here to make a deposit," Keanu said, his voice calm but edged with steel. "I'm here because I just watched you humiliate that woman." Brian blinked, his confident smile faltering. I don't know what you mean, sir. We were just helping a customer who had some difficulty with the transaction." "There was no difficulty with the transaction," Keanu corrected him gently. "There was a difficulty with your patience. There was a difficulty with your respect." He gestured backward toward Mrs. Gable without turning around. She was doing her best. She was trying to put money into your bank. Money that keeps this place running. And you treated her like she was a joke. You laughed at her. Lisa looked down at her shoes, her face flushing red. The color drained from Brian's face. He opened his mouth to speak, to deny it or make an excuse, but the words wouldn't come. Usually, customers were passive. Usually, they would just grumble and leave. But this man was different. He was holding them accountable. The bank had gone completely silent. The people in the line had stopped looking at their phones. The man in the gray suit was standing still, his mouth shut, watching the scene unfold with wide eyes. Even the security guard near the entrance was watching, unsure whether to step in. Keanu took a small step closer to the glass partition. He leaned in, his eyes locking onto Brian's. "You work in a service job," Keanu said, his voice dropping to a lower register, serious and intent. "Service means serving people. It means helping them, especially when things are hard for them. It doesn't matter if she's slow. It doesn't matter if she has coins. She is a human being, and she deserves to be treated with dignity." Brian swallowed hard. He looked like a child who had just been scolded by the principal. I was just following policy," he stammered weakly. "Policy doesn't tell you to laugh at people." Keanu shot back. "Policy doesn't tell you to be cruel. That was a choice you made." Keanu stood there for a moment, letting the silence stretch. He wanted the words to sink in. He wasn't yelling. He wasn't angry in a wild way. He was just intensely serious. He was standing up for someone who couldn't stand up for herself. Then he turned around. The movement was slow and deliberate. The tension in the air snapped as he shifted his focus from the teller's back to Mrs. Gable. His face changed instantly. The hard lines of anger softened. His eyes lost their steely edge and became warm and gentle. Mrs. Gable stood there, stunned. She hadn't recognized him at first with the hat on, but now that she saw his face, her breath caught in her throat. She knew who he was. Everyone knew who he was. But more than that, she saw the kindness in his eyes. She saw that he wasn't looking at her with pity, but with respect. He walked over to her, closing the distance between them. He ignored the rest of the room, the staring customers, the silent staff, the cameras, and the ceiling. In that moment, it was just the two of them. Mrs. Gable looked up at the man standing in front of her, her eyes wide and glistening with unshed tears. For a moment, the noise of the bank, the ticking clocks, and the distant traffic outside seemed to fade away. All she could see was his face. It was a face she recognized from movies and posters, a face that usually belonged to a world of fiction and action. But here, in the harsh fluorescent light of the bank, he was real. He was just a man, looking at her with a gentleness that she hadn't felt in years. "You don't have to go," he said softly, his voice low enough that only she could hear. He reached out and placed a hand lightly on her shoulder. His touch was firm but comforting, grounding her in the moment. "You didn't do anything wrong." "They did." Mrs. Gable trembled, a small sob escaping her throat. She tried to wipe her eyes again with her crumpled handkerchief, embarrassed to be crying in front of a movie star. I just want to put money in for my great-grandson," she whispered. "I didn't mean to be slow." Keanu shook his head slowly, his expression full of seriousness. "Ma'am, being slow isn't a crime. Being unkind is. You have nothing to apologize for." He turned his head back toward the counter, but he kept his body positioned between Mrs. Gable and the rest of the room. He looked at Brian, who was standing frozen behind his computer screen. The teller's face had gone pale, his earlier arrogance replaced with a look of pure panic. Lisa had stopped smirking entirely. She was now staring intently at her shoes, wishing she could disappear into the carpet. "Brian," Keanu said. It wasn't a shout, but the name carried across the silent bank, like a thunderclap. "You are going to help this lady complete her transaction. You are going to take her coins, you're going to count them, and you are going to treat her with the respect she deserves. Do you understand?" Brian swallowed hard, his atoms apple-bobbing. Yes, sir. I understand." "And you," Keanu said, glancing briefly at Lisa, "I suggest you find something productive to do that doesn't involve laughing at customers." Lisa nodded quickly, her face burning red. She turned and hurried away toward the filing cabinets, vanishing from sight. Keanu looked back at Mrs. Gable and gave her a small, encouraging nod. "Come on," he said. "Let's get this done." He walked her back to the counter. Mrs. Gable felt a surge of strength she hadn't felt 10 minutes ago. The fear that had been gripping her chest began to loosen. With Keanu standing beside her, she didn't feel small anymore. She felt protected. As they approached the counter, the line of customers watched in silence. The man in the gray suit, who had been so impatient earlier, was now looking down at his shoes, looking thoroughly ashamed of himself. No one complained about the delay. No one tapped their feet. Mrs. Gable placed her coin purse back on the counter. Her hands were still shaking a little, but not as badly as before. She opened it and began to slide the rolls toward Brian. Brian had dropped the arrogant act completely. He looked like a scolded child. He didn't sigh. He didn't roll his eyes. He reached out and took the rolls with careful hands. I can help you with these," he mumbled, not meeting Mrs. Gable's eyes. "I'll put them in the counter for you." He quickly counted the coins, his fingers moving fast. He typed the numbers into the computer with frantic energy, desperate to get the interaction over with, but also terrified of making another mistake. Keanu stood right there, his arms crossed over his chest, watching every move Brian made. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. His presence was a reminder that decency was non-negotiable. "There's also the cash," Mrs. Gable said, her voice a little stronger now. She pulled out the crisp dollar bills. Brian took them. "Yes, ma'am. Thank you. And I need a receipt," she added, surprising herself. Usually, she would have just accepted whatever they gave her to avoid trouble, but with Keanu beside her, she remembered her rights. "I'll print it right now," Brian said immediately. The silence in the bank was heavy, but it wasn't an angry silence anymore. It was a respectful one. People were witnessing a moment of correction, a realignment of how people should treat one another. The manager was still in his office, watching through glass, but he didn't come out. He knew better than to interfere. The printer whirred, and a slip of paper slid out. Brian tore it off and placed it on the counter, sliding it toward Mrs. Gable with both hands, a gesture of respect he should have used from the start. Here you go, ma'am. It's all taken care of. Mrs. Gable picked up the receipt. She looked at it, confirming the amount was correct. It was. She looked up at Brian. For a second, she thought about saying something sharp, about telling him he should be ashamed, but she looked at Keanu and remembered his words about kindness. She decided to take the high road. "Thank you," she said to Brian simply. Brian looked up, surprised. You're welcome," he stammered. "Have a good day." Keanu uncrossed his arms and turned to Mrs. Gable. "See," he said, a hint of a warm smile returning to his face. "Not so hard when people do their jobs, right?" Mrs. Gable let out a breath. She felt like she had been holding for an hour. "Thank you," she said to Keanu, her voice filled with emotion. "You didn't have to do that. I'm just an old lady." Keanu shook his head, looking at her with sincere intensity. "You are not just an old lady. You are a customer. You are a person. And you were trying to do something nice for your family. That matters." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a pen. He took the receipt from her hand. "Do you mind?" he asked. "Oh, no, go ahead," she said. He scribbled something quickly on the back of the receipt and handed it back to her. It was his autograph, but below it he had written a short message. "Never let anyone take your smile. If you ever have trouble here again, you just ask the manager," Keanu told her. "Or better yet, find a new bank. A bank that knows the value of its customers." "I think I will," Mrs. Gable said, clutching the receipt to her chest. He stood with her for a moment longer, making sure she was steady, making sure she truly felt that the ordeal was over. He didn't rush her. He didn't check his watch. He simply offered her the time and patience that Brian had refused to give. The icy atmosphere of the bank had thawed completely, replaced by a warmth that radiated from the simple act of standing up for someone who couldn't stand up for herself. Mrs. Gable felt her dignity returning, piece by piece, until she felt whole again. With the transaction finally finished and the receipt safely tucked away in Mrs. Gable's purse, Keanu stepped back slightly, giving her space. He didn't immediately turn to leave. He waited, watching her gather her things with a patience that felt like a warm blanket. Mrs. Gable snapped the clasp of her coin purse shut, the sound sharp in the quiet room. She took a deep breath, her chest rising and falling for the first time in what felt like ages without the weight of panic crushing it. "Are you okay to walk?" Keanu asked gently, his hands resting loosely in his pockets. "Yes," Mrs. Gable said, and to her surprise, she meant it. Her knees still ached, and her hands were still a little shaky, but the heavy cloud of humiliation had lifted. "I think I am." Keanu nodded. "Good. Let's get you out of here." He turned, and together they walked away from the counter. As they moved back toward the main aisle, the atmosphere in the bank shifted dramatically. The line of customers who had been restless and annoyed just minutes before was now perfectly still. The man in the gray suit, who had been checking his watch and sighing loudly, refused to make eye contact. He stared intensely at a flyer on the wall about mortgage rates, his face turning a shade of pink that matched his tie. He knew he had been complicit in the cruelty by his impatience, and seeing Keanu stand up for the woman had made him feel deeply ashamed of his own behavior. As Mrs. Gable and Keanu passed the other waiting customers, a few of them offered shy, tentative smiles. One woman even gave Mrs. Gable a small nod of respect. It was a silent acknowledgement that they had seen what happened, that they knew she had been wronged, and that they were glad justice had been served. Mrs. Gable held her head a little higher. She wasn't just a slow old lady anymore. She was someone who had been defended. Behind them, at the counter, Brian stood frozen. He was staring at his computer screen, but he wasn't seeing the numbers. He was seeing the replay of the last 20 minutes in his mind. He felt a hot, sick feeling in his stomach. The arrogance he had felt earlier, the funny joke he thought he would share with Lisa, had curdled into something bitter and painful. He looked over the empty spot where Lisa usually stood, but she was still hiding in the back, avoiding him and the customers alike. Even the manager, watching from the safety of his glass office, looked troubled. He hadn't stepped out to help Mrs. Gable, and now he realized that his silence had been a loud endorsement of the disrespect. The bank felt cold and empty, not because of the marble floors, but because the people inside had forgotten how to be human. Keanu guided Mrs. Gable toward the large glass sliding doors at the front of the branch. He walked at her pace, matching her slow, shuffling steps without making her feel rushed. It was a small gesture, but it meant the world to her. He wasn't pulling her forward. He was walking with her. They reached the vestibule. The sensor picked up their movement, and the door slid open with a soft hiss. The afternoon sun rushed in, along with the sound of the city. Cars honking, people talking, the hum of life continuing outside the sterile bubble of the bank. The air was warmer, smelling of exhaust fumes and hot pavement, but to Mrs. Gable, it smelled like freedom. Keanu stopped just before the exit. He didn't go outside immediately, knowing that if he stepped onto the sidewalk, cameras might appear and people might shout. He wanted to protect this moment, to keep it just for her. "Take care of yourself," he said, looking her in the eyes. "Thank you," Mrs. Gable said, her voice thick with emotion. She reached out and squeezed his hand. It was a firm grip, the grip of a grandmother thanking a grandson. "You didn't have to do that. Nobody does that anymore. People should," Keanu said simply. He smiled, a genuine, crinkle-eyed smile that made him look years younger. "Enjoy the gift for your great-grandson. I'm sure he'll love it." "I'll tell him about you," Mrs. Gable promised. "I'll tell him a real hero helped me today." Keanu shook his head modestly. "Just a regular guy, ma'am. Just a regular guy." He gave her a small salute with 2 fingers, and then turned back toward the bank. He didn't storm out. He didn't make a grand exit. He just turned and walked back into the room, perhaps to finish his own business, or perhaps just to ensure the staff didn't go back to their old ways the second he left. But for Mrs. Gable, his work was done. She stepped through the doors and out onto the sidewalk. The noise of the street wrapped around her. A bus rumbled past, shaking the ground beneath her feet. She looked up at the sky. It was a brilliant, clear blue. She took a deep breath, filling her lungs with air that didn't smell of judgment or mockery. She stood there for a moment, letting the sun warm her face. She looked down at her purse, where the signed receipt lay. She felt a profound sense of peace. The world could be cruel and people could be impatient, but she had just witnessed proof that kindness still existed. It wasn't gone. It was just waiting for someone brave enough to show it. Inside the bank, through the glass, she could see the tellers standing quietly. They looked smaller from out here, less intimidating. They were just people in uniforms, standing in a building. She realized that she didn't need to fear them anymore. She had stood her ground with a little help, and she had survived. Mrs. Gable adjusted her coat and tightened her grip on her purse. She looked toward the bus stop down the street. The walk seemed shorter now. Her knees still hurt, yes, but her heart felt light. She began to walk, moving a little faster than before. She had a story to tell when she got home. She had a story about the day the world stopped spinning so fast, just for a moment, and a stranger made sure she was okay. As she walked away, she didn't look back at the bank. She looked forward, and for the first time in a long time, she was smiling. It was a small smile, but it was real. And as the city noise buzzed around her, she hummed a soft tune, feeling the rhythm of life again, knowing that kindness was the most important currency of all, and today she had been given a fortune of it.